which means we can make reasonable choices that are not entirely going to screw us over. Before I move on to explain why we reduce violence, I'll take a point. Okay, on violence then. Contextually, these groups are unlikely to die out for 3 reasons. First, they are just a different group of people compared to the wider state, right? They have fundamental religious or cultural differences, which means that it's very obvious to them that they are just completely separate people, which presents a very clear distinction that means that they're unlikely to die out. Secondly, refusing sovereignty is seen as a form of oppression, which means that people get angry when they see these things happen, when they don't get the sovereignty, and this type of anger can be passed down through generations. But lastly, they're established groups to represent their interests. This looks like the IRA in Ireland, or like the Tigray Liberation Front in Ethiopia. They represent their interests in a very powerful way. But note here, they often have a lot of regional control, which means they can do things like control education. And this means a lot of young children are brought up with this dream of liberation. There are always going to be people out there who care about having sovereignty. What is side opposition likely to do then to retain control over that region? 3 things. First, if they care so much about control, they just resort to oppression. And this looks like if there's a large amount of protesters, you just have to increase police presence and you just have to commit violence to shut them down, because there's no other way to prevent these movements from boiling over. But no, pressures to crack down also exist, just because they are seen as dangerous or deviate from the societal norm, which means that pressures on the government is to crack down on these people. Secondly, they want to dilute the political will of separatism. This just looks like flooding these regions with their own migrants to drown out the political will, and this can be harmful for a couple of reasons I'll explain later. But lastly, they want to portray the movement as illegitimate, right? They depict their leaders as irrational in the media, but they also just use the media to ignore the sentiments held by the average people and try to draw it away from how the normal person feels. How does this lead to violence for the wider state then? 4 reasons. First, movements feel unheard. The perceived oppression compounds year on year, when entire generations grow up and die without being able to feel the freedom of controlling their own people. And these people are often just politically disenfranchised, right? That is part of the reason why they want independence in the first place. And so when alternatives to violence become unuseful to these groups, they turn to violence because that's the only way they feel as though they're able to get independence. Secondly, they develop prejudices against the wider population, because it's hard to blame a government for the average person. But when you see more police cracking down on you, or you see more migrants wearing a specific cult, religious clothing, or having a slightly different skin color to you, you associate all of your struggles with those groups of people, and you associate the anger and hatred with them. Thirdly, violent responses they just have violent responses to state violence, right? Separatist movements are able to become more organized militarily when they're violently oppressed, because they're just able to, unify the group of people together. But fourthly, it's tied up with your identity as a separatist, right? The movement grows year on year, and individuals commit more extreme acts overall when it's seen as an extension of your autonomy to be able to live in your own sovereign state. But note here, very few people are required to commit very large acts of violence, right? It only takes one person to commit a car bombing. It can be very damaging for these people. What are the outcomes of this then? Firstly, there are just more acts of violence on a very micro level. What this can look like is the people from the wider country being a minority in these specific regions, and so they commit more acts of street violence against them. When they're being bet up in the street and unable to walk to school the next day, it's just really harmful for these people subjectively. And notice that this is more likely the stronger the state tries to reduce their reduce